Hi, welcome to Bike and Psych. Today we're going to talk about the ABCs of psychological well-being. Hi, welcome to Bike and Psych. So today we're going to look at the ABCs of psychological well-being. So the A stands for autonomy, the B stands for belonging, and the C stands for competence. So this is a handout that was sent round by a couple of my tutors from Birkbeck, and they said to share it with your practice. So you're kind of my practice really, so I'm going to share it with you on a Bike and Psych. So what does this relate to? Well, actually they're drawing here from a theory called self-determination theory by a couple of psychologists called Deci and Ryan. Now this has been around for a long time and it's a really well respected theory. It basically relates to, I suppose initially it was around motivation and how you can motivate people. So if you've ever worked for a business where you've had to look after people, or you've been a manager, or maybe you just observed it yourself and you've noticed that some people are just not motivated, and maybe you're not motivated sometimes and you wonder why that is. Well, that was kind of the first reason for doing this theory, but it is related to mental health as well, or at least well-being, let's say. So in what way? So let's have a look at the ABCs again. So basically what this theory says is that in order for people to be happy, they need to be intrinsically motivated by what they do. So that could obviously relate to work, but it could relate to other things as well. So intrinsic motivation is compared to extrinsic motivation. So intrinsic would be things that really matter to you, something that is really meaningful to you at a deep level. Whereas an extrinsic motivator would be typically money or material reward. And the natural thing for us to think is that people are motivated by material reward. But what they found was that if people are satisfied through intrinsic motivation, it makes them much more willing to do what it takes, if you like, and work harder, and they kind of do it because they want to. And this links to mental health because people are much happier when they're doing things that are related to their intrinsic motivations. In fact, this was so important to Deci and Ryan that they described these three elements. In fact, they didn't call it the ABCs, they identified it as autonomy, relatedness instead of belonging, and competence. So I think my tutors have tweaked it a bit to make it a bit easier to remember, the ABCs. But essentially it's the same thing. Deci and Ryan are two very interesting characters. They started off as behavioural psychologists. Now behavioural psychologists, in a way, it's all about extrinsic reward. It's kind of, you're giving people an extrinsic reward, like a bonus, or if it's an animal, some sort of reward like food or a treat. And it was believed by the behaviourists, this is a branch of psychology around the 1950s, kind of became very popular. They believed that was it, that was our psychology. It was just basically, it's all about reward, positive reinforcement and all that. And Deci and Ryan were kind of in that school, but they also were influenced by the other group of psychologists called the humanists. They were frustrated that the humanists just kind of talked about theory and never actually did any experiments. So they kind of decided to do an experiment. Now, experiments are always hard to describe, but basically what they found was that if you gave people a monetary reward for doing a task, it didn't really work any harder than the ones that you didn't give a monetary reward to. But what was really fascinating was when you stopped giving the reward, they stopped working. Whereas those that you didn't give a reward to carried on. So it's really interesting that this powerful need to work and do things was very much at play here. And as far as they were concerned, this played into a very natural need that human beings have to be curious and to be motivated to do things, and that played into their, I suppose, a very idealistic view of humanity, whereas perhaps the behaviourist is a bit grim. But they identified these three things as being needs, psychological needs: autonomy, relatedness, belonging, and competence were seen as absolutely necessary. Cheers. These three things were considered to be needs, just like physical needs, like eating and sleeping, and that if people didn't have these fulfilled, they would be unhappy, and in some cases it could lead to some sort of psychopathology. They also found that if people were rewarded with one but at the cost of another, that would also create damage. An example they gave, which I thought was really interesting, was of a child brought up to abandon their own sense of autonomy, in other words their agency, doing what, within reason. As a child grows up, you expect to give them freedom, but if you denied that to them on the basis that they got love and affection, then that could be a very sort of pathological result. So I thought that was quite interesting. So let's just review those three again. So autonomy is the feeling that you have agency to do something. You're able to make decisions for yourself, and you have some power, if you like, over what you're doing. Hiya. It's all right. Thank you. Okay. So the A is this autonomy, feeling that you have some control over your own destiny, and that's seen as an absolute psychological need. The B, belonging or relatedness, is this feeling that you need to be part of a community, you need to relate to somebody or something else, and that's again another psychological need. So if you don't get that, you are likely to suffer some sort of psychological, if not damage, stress, let's say. And the C is competence. So this is interesting. It's a feeling that you are capable, you're competent at doing something, you're good at something, if you like. And this is a psychological need. We all need to feel that we are worth something. So if you put those three together, I guess it's kind of no surprise that to have good mental health, you need to feel that you have some control over yourself and what you're doing. You have that feeling of autonomy, you have some control over what you're doing. You have that feeling of belonging, you have a place and you can relate to other people and a community of some sort. And the C is this feeling of worth, that you're competent, you're good at something, you can do something, you've got some self-esteem. And this comes out again and again in all sorts of research, including some that I'm doing currently on recovering from or leaving a high control religion. It's absolutely right there as well. So those are the three ABCs, if you like, or those are the ABCs. Now when it comes to our current situation, the reason that my tutor sent this round was because obviously at the moment people might be feeling some stress, and that's partly because maybe they're feeling that their sense of autonomy has been reduced. We've not been able to go outside, there's still things we can't do. That can cause stress and anxiety. You can see how that relates. If you feel that you can't go anywhere, you're stuck at home, you can't do your job, you've got restrictions, and that obviously affects your feelings of autonomy. You might feel very isolated because you are not able to see your family or your friends. That can obviously have an effect on your relatedness or your feeling of belonging. And competence, the things you're good at might well be related to your job or things that you can't do at the moment. So I guess the advice there is to find ways of fulfilling those needs in another way. So whilst there are things you can't do, the idea is to focus on what you can do. So yes, okay, so you don't have as much autonomy in terms of going out and doing things like that, but what do you have control over? One of those things, of course, is how you respond to this current situation. So you have autonomy over your own response. That's one of the bits of advice. Feeling of belonging, I think we've all got to be much better at using Skype and Zoom and other devices to keep in touch with our relatives and friends, and I think we just need to carry on doing that. Thank you. So if we carry on doing that, you know, even when this is all over, I guess we're going to perhaps keep in touch more with some of our far flung relatives, I guess. I tend to speak to my mum and dad more than I've ever done, although they only live about 10 miles away. I Skype them every few days, so I think that's actually quite a good thing to do. And this competence, you know, one of the things that we have, I guess, an opportunity to do is to try things that we've not had time to do before. So one of the great things on Facebook that if you're interested, I recommend you check it out, is called the Lockdown Gallery, and that's just an opportunity for people to express themselves creatively, but it means people are able to express themselves in ways that is kind of important to them. So that's another thing to consider. But again, rather than worrying about what we're not able to do, the idea of competence in this situation is to think, right, what can I do? How can I excel? What can I do that will demonstrate that? Right, so it's getting windy again now, so I think I'm going to wrap it up there. So thank you very much for listening to Psych. Please subscribe, and we'll talk about more psychology next time. Thank you.